There's a strange contradiction you may have noticed in your own life. Every serious piece of advice tells you that consistency is the key to success. Show up every day. Do the same thing again and again, no matter how you feel. And yet, when you try to live this way, something quietly breaks down. You start strong, you build momentum, and then, almost inexplicably, you stall. Not because you stopped caring, but because the effort begins to feel misaligned, heavy in a way you can't quite justify. What makes this more confusing is that the advice isn't wrong. You've seen consistency work. You've watched people transform their bodies, master instruments, or build careers through repetition. So when it doesn't work for you, the conclusion feels obvious and painful. You assume the problem is a lack of discipline, a character flaw, a failure of the will. But that conclusion hides a more uncomfortable truth. The frustration you feel isn't about effort. It's about being handed a rule without being told when that rule applies. Most consistency advice is delivered as if it were a universal law like gravity. Miss a day and you're weak. Break a streak and you're unserious. The hidden message is that if progress isn't linear, it doesn't count. Over time, this creates a quiet anxiety. You start to mistrust your own rhythms. Every dip in energy feels like backsliding. Every pause feels like proof that you're not built for long-term progress. Let's be clear about something before we go any further. This is not an excuse for avoidance or chronic half-effort. There's real value in showing up when things are uncomfortable. The issue isn't that consistency demands too much. It's that it demands the same thing in the same way across situations that are fundamentally different. Think about the difference between training for a marathon and learning a new language. Marathon training rewards steady, almost boringly predictable repetition. The body adapts well to gradual, consistent stress. It's a biological contract. But language learning doesn't progress in clean lines. You can study for weeks, months even, and feel utterly stuck, mired in the gray, then suddenly snap. You experience a leap in understanding so profound it feels like a haunting, coming after a period of apparent soul-crushing stagnation. Applying the same expectations to both creates more than just friction. It creates unnecessary, corrosive self-blame. Psychologists sometimes describe this difference as the environment you're operating in. Some environments are stable. The rules don't change much. The feedback is immediate, and honestly, consistency thrives here. It's safe. Other environments, however, are inherently unstable. The rules shift like sand, feedback is delayed by a cryptic silence, and progress happens in jagged jumps rather than measured steps. In these environments, blind consistency can feel like running in place, or worse, like trying to hammer a nail into a reflection. This is where the tension lives. It breathes. You're told, by every productivity guru and grind set manual, to treat every goal as if it exists in that first orderly world, even when your lived experience is screaming that it doesn't. So you keep pushing. You push in the exact same way, assuming the friction means you're just not trying hard enough, not dedicated enough, when in reality, you may be applying a sledgehammer to a cloud. You're using the wrong tool for a world that refuses to be measured. If consistency isn't a universal solution, if it's actually a trap in the wrong hands, then the real question becomes more interesting and infinitely more unsettling. What do you replace it with when the world you're operating in doesn't reward straight lines? And how do you know the difference before you burn yourself out at trying to force a masterpiece from a brick? To understand why consistency starts to fail you, you have to look more closely. I mean really look at the kind of environment you're actually trying to succeed in. Most advice quietly, almost deceptively, assumes you're operating in a world that is stable and predictable. The inputs are clear, the rules are etched in stone, and if you repeat the same behavior long enough, improvement shows up. Right on schedule. This is the world where consistency shines. It's why habits work so well in the gym, why scales and metronomes exist, and why repetition can sculpt the body with an almost terrifying mechanical reliability. But many of the goals you actually give a damn about, they don't live in that world. They live in environments where progress is jagged, feedback is a ghost, and the rules shift while you're still trying to catch your breath. Creative work, intellectual growth, career development, even the simple act of emotional regulation fall into this category. You can show up every day, bleed for the cause, and still feel like nothing. Not because you're failing, but because the system doesn't reward effort in smooth, polite increments. It's not a staircase. It's a sheer cliff with hidden handholds. This mismatch creates a specific, jagged kind of psychological damage. When consistency doesn't produce results, You don't question the gospel of the grind. No, you question yourself. You double down on force. You try to flatten your own natural fluctuations, assuming that any dip in energy or a wandering interest is a defect, a bug in the system that needs to be purged. Over time, this turns consistency from a supportive scaffold into a crushing leaden weight. You see it in the streak. A streak is marketed as a motivator, but for many, it becomes brittle, fragile. A glass ceiling. One missed day feels catastrophic, not because the work is lost, but because the identity you've duct taped to that streak collapses in an instant. The behavior was never anchored to the terrain. It was anchored to the performance of an unbroken line. This is where a quiet but lethal distinction starts to matter. There's a massive difference between being committed to a direction and being rigid about the path. Consistency, in its bluntest form, trains rigidity. It demands the same output regardless of context, mood, or the phase of the moon. In stable environments, that rigidity is a superpower. In unstable ones, it's just a slow, disciplined way to break yourself. Consider how children learn complex skills. They don't improve by performing evenly every day, not even close. They surge forward in a feverish heat, then nothing. They plateau. They obsess to the point of exhaustion, then suddenly they disengage entirely. Their nervous systems cycle with a beautiful, chaotic rhythm between deep absorption and necessary rest. Forcing adult expectations of linear consistency onto that process would look absolutely absurd. It would be a tragedy of misunderstanding. And yet, that's exactly what many people do to themselves the moment a goal becomes serious. At this point, it's tempting, cathartic even, to swing to the opposite extreme and reject consistency altogether. To declare it outdated, oppressive, or fundamentally incompatible with the mess of modern life. But that reaction? It misses the point just as badly as blind devotion does. The problem isn't consistency itself. Consistency is just a tool. The problem is treating it as the primary organizing principle in environments where something else, something more fluid, should be in charge. So the question sharpens. If consistency is only one tool in the belt, what determines when it should be pulled out? And if it isn't the foundation in complex shifting domains, what kind of structure can replace it without collapsing into a heap of chaos or a pile of convenient excuse-making? To answer that, you first need a different, perhaps more uncomfortable way of thinking about effort itself, not as a straight, predictable line, but as a pattern, a living thing that unfolds over time. When you stop expecting effort to look the same every day, a different and far more honest pattern begins to come into focus. Progress in many domains doesn't behave like a straight line at all. It behaves more like a series of waves. Periods of intense, almost frantic engagement are followed by quieter phases where absolutely nothing seems to be happening on the surface. The mistake, the fatal mistake, most people make is assuming the quiet phases are failures, when in reality, they are often exactly where the deep, invisible integration happens. Biology gives us a useful, if neglected, lens here. Muscles don't grow during the workout. That's just the destruction. They grow during recovery. If you applied the logic of pure, unyielding consistency to physical training, you would try to stress the muscle at the same grueling intensity every single day, and you would, inevitably, shatter yourself. Growth depends on alternating between load and rest, between strain and repair. Yet when it comes to mental or creative work, people expect themselves to operate at a constant robotic output, completely ignoring the biological cost. This is where the idea of replacing consistency begins to take shape, though not yet in full. What matters more than showing up identically each day is maintaining alignment with a longer, more profound arc of effort. You are not failing because today feels lighter than yesterday. You fail only when you lose contact with the direction entirely. The problem, the tragedy, is that most advice doesn't teach you how to hold direction without clinging to rigid, soul-crushing routines. Think about how interest works. In the early stages of learning something new, curiosity does most of the heavy lifting. Attention comes easily. It's intoxicating. Energy feels abundant. Then, as novelty fades, the work changes. It becomes quieter, more technical, significantly less emotionally stimulating. This transition is where many people assume something has gone horribly wrong. They try to force the original level of excitement to continue, and when it doesn't, they interpret the drop as a signal to quit, or worse, as evidence of a weak and fractured character. But this drop, it's not a bug. It's a phase shift. The nervous system is moving from the thrill of exploration to the heavy lifting of consolidation. Treating this moment as a test of raw, blind consistency is what creates that unnecessary, avoidable burnout. You're asking a system designed for brilliant adaptation to behave like a cold, unthinking machine. What replaces the consistency, then, is not chaos, and certainly isn't indulgence. It's a different organizing principle altogether, one that respects cycles instead of denying them. This principle allows for variation without losing an ounce of momentum. It accounts for periods of high output and periods of apparent silent stillness without attaching a shred of moral judgment to either. The difficulty, the reason we resist this, is that this kind of structure is harder to see. A streak is visible, a daily habit is easy to measure and brag about. Cycles, seasons, and phases, they're messier. They require you to zoom out, to evaluate progress over months instead of minutes, and to trust processes that don't offer the constant sugary reassurance of a checkbox. Most people have never been taught how to do that. Never. So they default to what's concrete and simple, even when it grinds against their very psychology. They mistake uniformity for commitment and confuse essential flexibility with weakness. In the next part, we'll put a name to this alternative structure and examine how it functions in real life. Once you can see it clearly, consistency stops being the ruler you beat yourself with and becomes something far more strategic, a weapon you wield, rather than a chain you drag. What replaces consistency is not a feeling, and it's certainly not motivation, that fickle fair-weather friend. It's structure, but a different, more sophisticated kind of structure than most people are ever taught to use. Instead of organizing your effort around the myth of sameness, you organize it around phases. Instead of asking, with that familiar edge of guilt, whether you showed up the same way today, you ask whether you are still inside the same season of work. A season is defined by its intention, not its daily grind down the gears output. In one season, the goal might be expansion. You read widely, you experiment, you chase curiosity down every rabbit hole, and you allow yourself to follow energy rather than ruthlessly suppressing it. In another season, the goal is refinement. You narrow your focus, you kill your darlings, and you deepen what you already understand. From the outside, these seasons can look messy, inconsistent, even erratic. But from the inside, they are perfectly, beautifully coherent. This is how complex systems, real, living systems, actually develop. Companies don't scale by doing the exact same thing every day for eternity. They explore, then they exploit. Athletes don't train at peak bone-shattering intensity year-round. They cycle. Even ecosystems depend on variation, the violent, necessary periods of growth, decay, and renewal. Consistency only works when the environment is static. Most meaningful goals simply aren't. What makes this difficult, what makes it terrifying, is that seasons demand a higher level of brutal self-honesty. A daily habit absolves you from thinking. You follow the rule, you check the box, and you move on like a ghost. A seasonal approach forces you to ask much harder questions. What phase am I actually in right now? What does progress look like in this specific terrain? What kind of effort serves this moment, rather than just satisfying my frantic fear of falling behind? This is where many people get stuck. They sense intuitively that rigid consistency is suffocating them, but they don't trust themselves. Not really. Enough to replace it with something more flexible. So they oscillate between forcing routines and abandoning them entirely in a fit of pique. The result is a nauseating cycle of intensity, guilt, and inevitable collapse. A phase-based structure interrupts that loop. It shatters it. It allows you to work with a blinding intensity without demanding that you stay there forever. It gives you permission to rest without framing that rest as a moral regression. Most importantly, it reconnects effort to context. You're no longer asking yourself to be the same person every single day. You're asking yourself to stay engaged with the direction over the long haul. This doesn't make the work easier. In some ways, it's significantly harder. You lose the false, sugary comfort of streaks and simple metrics. You have to develop judgment. You have to tolerate the agonizing ambiguity of the plateau. You have to trust deep in your bones that progress can be real, even when it isn't immediately visible on a dashboard. But something changes when you do. The anxiety around missed days begins to fade into the background. The internal accusation, the one that whispers, "I'm not consistent enough," finally loses its grip. In its place, a quieter, more dangerous confidence emerges. You stop trying to dominate your own psychology like a tyrant and start cooperating with it. Consistency, then, is no longer the goal. It becomes a tool you use selectively, sharpened and ready when the environment supports it. The foundation is something deeper, a sustained, unshakable orientation toward embracing the meaningful aim expressed through phases that evolve exactly as you do. And once you see your effort this way, the question shifts one last time. It's no longer, how do I force myself to be consistent? It becomes something far more useful and far more honest. What season am I in right now, and what kind of work does this season actually ask of me? Thanks for watching. I hope this helps you a lot. I will see you in the next one.